Well, hello.
Hey,
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. Look at that background.
Look at your background.
Oh, yes. Well, welcome everyone. This is our inaugural opportunity to talk about race and things that are happening in and around our country. And we'll kind of give some detail as to how we will approach this, at least from the university's perspective. We have about 24 participants, so this is a nice start for us. Um, the race and uh, the leaving it blank there, conversations about race in America webcast starts today. I'm Dr. Rob Shelby. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Evansville. And I wanted to try to set the stage for what we are going to do for at least today and then for the next several weeks. And the plan is to carry this through at least as a summer series. We'll take a pause with the start of classes on our campus and then start again by including other voices. So we'll be hearing from some of our students, some of our staff members, and even reaching into our community to hear their perspective and ideas and thoughts as it relates to conversations about race in America. So we are truly living in unprecedented times with social impacts from COVID-19, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery in February, Breonna Taylor in March, George Floyd in May, the calls for reforms to policing and criminal justice, lynchings, voter access to for state primaries and leading up to the presidential election. We even now have the removal of Confederate statues, the emergence of social movements, and so many other things happening, all while we are under some sense of quarantine. These topics have a race dimension that are of significant concern for many of our students, employees, and the greater Evansville community. The summer portion of the series begins today and ends Wednesday, August the 5th. Each session will consist of a 1-hour webinar discussion with UE community members about race and we'll fill in that blank week after week with different topics, depending on the guest's expertise and just desire to talk about topics related to race. And so before we start today, a few housekeeping details I wanted to share. So the format will consist of a conversation between me and the weekly guest. And during the conversation, I want to encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. You likely will see the chat feature there as well. And while I won't be monitoring it because it's just me, I will be monitoring the Q&A portion. And at the end of kind of our conversation, we'll jump into the questions and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can before we finish within the hour. I will share that students will be helping us in the weeks to come, so they'll be monitoring the Q&A section and the chat feature, so we try to address as much as we can during the time that we have together. So this week's guest is Dr. Diane Brewer. Dr. Brewer teaches theater history and dramatic criticism, serves as the department's resident dramaturg, and directs text-based as well as ensemble-generated productions. She earned her BA from Tufts University and a PhD from UCLA. She is a member of the Library Managers and Dramaturgs of Americas and the Network of Ensemble Theaters. Dr. Brewer, welcome to the webcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. I wonder I hope that was a sufficient enough introduction. You can add more if you like.
No, that's more than adequate.
Okay, great. I invited Dr. Brewer, and I'm going to call her Diane because that's how we kind of relate to each other. The titles are great, but she is a dear colleague, and I can tell you that from my time being at the University of Evansville, first as a professor and now as the Chief Diversity Officer, we have had numerous conversations, some of them over tears, about matters related to race and how we can be better not just as an institution, but how we can be better as individuals as we're working with students and students coming from a really wide range of backgrounds. Um, so I wanted to try to set the tone as far as our talking points today. So um, the goal here is for us to have a conversation, and we're inviting those of you who are on the webcast to participate, or at least to sit in on our conversation, and then we'll just go from there. So Diane, why don't you get us started off?
Oh my goodness. I'm nervous. I
It's,
don't usually get nervous. um, well, should I start with the quote I always start with?
please do.
So I guess there's a quote that I write on the board at the beginning of every semester, and I have found myself returning to it during this time for myself. I usually write it on the board for the students, but it's something that I am finding helpful for me too in this moment. And it's an Arthur Ashe quote: start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I really, the reason I write it on the board for the students is that I want to make sure that students understand that even though I'm going to be asking them to stretch in ways that might be uncomfortable at times, that I'm also really wanting to meet them where they are, help them discover skills that maybe they don't know that they have, and then really be um, self-motivating to reach goals that maybe they hadn't considered before. And the reason that feels so helpful for me right now is that, you know, I'm in the middle of a deep dive with my own classes and my own curriculum, trying to think about how I can be proactively anti-racist in what I'm doing, and reminding myself that I can't solve every problem in the world in every class that I teach, but I can kind of reflect on where I am, what I have, and what I can do as I'm also working with the students. So that's kind of where I am.
Yeah, and I think that's how we kind of got into this conversation, right? It's been a series of um, uh, I guess a part of the work that's been happening in the theater department. There's a fantastic structure, I think, that is really taking form there. And while those on the call are coming from many different backgrounds, some may be professors like yourself. They may be administrators on our campus. They may be a part of our broader community, maybe students. But one of the reasons why I wanted to have you be a part of this initial conversation is I think some of our conversations have really revolved around one, recognizing um, as an individual in the classroom, understanding where you are in the process, because everyone's on this journey, so to speak, of trying to understand how to become. I like the way you phrased it. Purposefully anti-racist. That is a very proactive way to be thinking about this. Um, and one of the things that I'm very mindful of is that we can, as an institution of higher education, we're often thinking very deeply about these things, but it also requires a bit of action on our part as well. And so, um, I wonder if you could kind of talk to um, well, I don't want to use you purely as a pure example, right? Because that puts a lot of pressure on the students who will then, be taking your classes in the fall. Will be like, "Hey, I saw you on that webinar, and you said you were doing X, and you're doing Y." But I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what that journey has looked like for you.
Yeah, it has been, I guess, okay, so looking at one class in particular that I teach a course to all incoming first-year students called Survey and Analysis of Dramatic Literature. And so, of course, that raises a lot of questions for me about what the canon is in this time, what that means. Am I reinforcing racism unconsciously, right? That's my first question. You know, just by the plays that I'm choosing to teach and the way that I'm choosing to teach those plays. My first question is, am I unconsciously reinforcing racism? And, you know, the answer is, of course, yes. But what can I do? What can I do to interrupt that? And what does it have to do? Like, how do I do that if I've been teaching for 25 years? And I have gotten used to, you know, it's not like I teach the same plays every semester, but I've gotten used to a way of teaching, a way of approaching those plays. And I've also gotten used to the way my students respond to different plays. So I can walk into a classroom and I sort of know how they're going to respond to any play. And it's like I know where they're going to begin, and I know where I want to get them to, because, you know, because I understand the whole framework of the class, and how we get there is always different. But what feels different now in this moment is that where they're beginning and my confidence about where I want to get them to is all changing.
Yes. Yes. Which is why this moment is so crucial, right? I often say, you know, for anyone who's working with young people or human beings in general, if you want to be successful, you obviously need to master your content, and that's what you're talking about, right? You've been teaching these plays for a very long time. You know the ins and outs, the nuances, kind of the levers, so to speak, of how it impacts and elicits certain responses at certain stages along the way. And the variable that is certainly shifting is that variable of the students. And so we need to understand our students just as well as we understand the plays, so to speak. So the living variable are those human beings who sit in our classes, who, you know, live on our campus, who are eating in our dining facilities, living in the residence halls, you know, so on and so forth. And so this moment really does, at least for all accounts, it really suggests that we are living in a time where our students are going to potentially come to campus, given all of the things that they've experienced since March. And they're not just going to check that at the door, so to speak. They're going to bring it with them, and they're going to bring some of that to bear. It becomes a part of their lens for understanding what it is that they're engaging in the classroom. And so I think in our conversation, how do you then go about trying to, I guess, understand the student's starting point at the same time of, you know, recognizing that you are the content expert in the room?
So I think it's multiple things. I guess the strategy that I'm applying is, on one hand, I am kind of actively participating with students and colleagues in an anti-racist book club. So just doing lots of reading. This is something that was started by a student. So coming together once a week, every week there's a book that we read, and then a movie that we watch. So coming together in places where I'm in no way the expert, and I get to just be a participant with the same people that I'm working with, has been a really important part of it. The other thing that I have been doing is just a lot of reading. Like, I've been reading a lot of plays that I hadn't ever read before. And then, and this has been crucial, talking to alums and talking to current students. So my question is right now, what plays am I going to teach, and how am I going to teach them? And for example, one of the plays that in the last year students have started to object to is a play called M. Butterfly by David Henry Hwang. And so it's caused me to step back and look at, why am I teaching this play? Does it still have value? Does it still connect to the bigger goal? Well, I have a student who took the class with me when he was 18 years old, and he's now 34. And in the time between when he was 18 and 34, he has actually performed in that play. And we've had conversations about it being a difficult experience for him. So I called him and said, can we talk about this play? I would love to get your perspective on it. And as I tried to go into that conversation with an attitude of, I want to really listen to what you have to say about this play. I don't want you to confirm for me that I'm okay and I can just keep doing things the way I've always done them. And there were a couple of things that I heard him say, which, I mean, beyond us just talking about the play and getting very specific about specific moments in the play, he also talked to me about what it meant to him as an 18-year-old to have encountered the play as a young Asian man, and what it means to him, and how he continues to think about it as a 34-year-old. And which is also such a great reminder for me that when these 18-year-olds come into my classroom, I'm not just teaching 18-year-olds. I am also looking at students who I know are going to continue to grow, and this is going to continue to connect to what they're doing in their lives, right? So it isn't just, I'm not just teaching 18-year-olds. I'm also teaching 34-year-olds and 40-year-olds, and pretty soon it'll be 50-year-olds. So there's that. And then as we were talking, one of the things that I said to him was, I just don't know if 18-year-olds are ready for this level of complication. And he said one thing to me. He said, really? And then he left it at that. And that's the thing that has stuck with me the most. Him saying, really, are you sure that they can't handle this? And they can't let it be complicated and ambiguous? So there was that conversation. The other thing that I did or have been doing is having conversations with current students and one recent alum, and actually and saying, hey, here are some plays that I'm thinking about including in the curriculum. You've been through the class with me recently. Can we talk about these plays together as I'm thinking about whether to include them? And so we just had our first conversation about a play yesterday. And what was really amazing about that conversation was, so I go into it thinking about big structural questions, and you know, I'm reading the last part of the play and thinking, oh my goodness, this is the, you know, what she's saying here is so exactly the structure of Oedipus and all of that, and blah 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 blah, right? And that, but when I had the conversation with the students, that's not what they're thinking about, right? They're thinking about microaggressions and their exhaustion. And yeah, so it was just a really great reminder for me that when I pick up a play, what I'm seeing is not necessarily what's important to them. But by the end of the conversation, we were both starting to think about, well, what if I were to start the semester with this play? What would that mean for the rest of the semester? What would that do to the structure of the class as a whole? And, you know, and I was asking them things like, well, what if I were to drop this part, right? And some of them said, oh yeah, definitely, you should definitely drop that. And other people said, no, don't drop that. Don't do that, because that's really, really important. So that's sort of where it is right now.
So yeah, along the way there, I think some of the things that I really gravitate to, or I want to highlight, is students taking an initiative to be involved in the process, you know, where it warrants. I think that's one of the things that, you know, I've seen in various, you know, departments and programs on campus where there is a high degree of student involvement. One of the things I would like to see more, if I could have my wish list, one of the things that would be at the top would be to see in each department where there is a group of students who have taken that initiative to kind of provide that kind of or maintain a dialogue between kind of a student representation of especially the students coming from diverse backgrounds, and being able to speak to the faculty members in that department to really give them a sense of, you know, of how they're processing. And this kind of leads me to my next point. And it became really clear for me, certainly through my lived experience, but also talking to many of our students of color on campus, that when starting with material, it can be that some are starting with the assumption, very similar to what you were describing, where it's just purely about the material. But the students are starting from the point of lived experience, right? So if we're talking about domestic students of color, if we're talking about, because we're talking about race, if we're talking about ethnicity too, as we kind of pull that in here, they're coming from outside of the United States context. They're bringing that with them, and it is a part of, it is the starting point. And so the way that I try to get folks to understand this is that almost from, you know, the first opportunity for a young person of color to understand the world around them is they recognize their racial composition within the broader social context. It is always at the forefront of our minds. It is not like we have moments where we turn it off and then other moments when we turn it on. It is in a constant state of being on. Mm-hmm. And so when we then engage material, regardless of the discipline, but because we're talking about plays and things that also it has an emotive aspect to it, right? So it's designed in order to touch the human existence, the human emotion. and that's exactly what it does. But it strikes them at the place where they're coming from their racial or ethnic identity, and so it makes sense, at least to me, as a Black man, it makes complete sense that that is what we're experiencing. And yet, even as I'm kind of I'm explaining that, I'm older than our students, right? So their lived experience and the way in which they're processing, this cultural moment is different than the way in which I am processing it. So so what I'm saying is, I know for a fact that many of our students over the summer have been involved in the protests. And as a response to what has been happening to, unarmed Black people being killed by law enforcement, or the lynchings, as I mentioned, and the investigations that are going with that. And so all of this is a part of their identity context. And so it should make sense to us that that is going to be a part of the framework by which they're then understanding plays and other material. Now, it is also true that we're talking about theater. This may not be the case when we're talking about math, right? Or chemistry. But it in no way means that those students have shut this aspect of who they are off. They're still processing all of that information through that identity, and it's absolutely crucial to this process. And so I want to pick up on something that you said here too. Two things. This idea about rewriting what you think you know about your students, and then what you have to offer them. Can you talk about that for a moment? Because it can seem as if there is no way forward, because there's no way you could understand them, and they can't understand you as the other.
Right. I think what's really interesting is actually in a very circuitous way, that was exactly the focus of my dissertation. So it doesn't surprise me that that's how I'm continuing to think about these circumstances. I am absolutely fascinated by what that process of reaching someone who feels like an other is. So that's just a little self-reflection there.
Yes.
But I think, so this idea that I have to rewrite everything I think I know is probably the scariest part of the process for me, but also the most important part. In some ways, I'm the kind of person who goes to, I know nothing before I can get to a place where I feel like there's something that I can hold on to. Like I'm always doubting what I think I know. And, sometimes I tell the students, every single time I pick up a play, my first response, my first thought in my mind is, there's a really good possibility I'm never going to understand this play. So what that has been for me is, what I think I know is rooted in my graduate education, which was very focused on the Greeks. And I have always been interested in disrupting that. So it doesn't, so it's not super scary. But it has gotten to the point where I've had to ask myself, does Oedipus even belong in my syllabus? And that is scary because Oedipus has always been in my syllabus, but I've set the syllabus up so it's not chronological. I was already on that train, right? But it was the foundation that then became the point where we could then look at things that were intentionally anti-Aristotelian, right? And so that was the framework. And then I've had to say, well, what if that framework doesn't exist anymore? What if that framework is actually doing more damage than necessary? And the first time where it felt like maybe there was a little bit of an opening was in a conversation with another student where I don't know how it came up, but I heard myself saying, well, what if I don't start with Oedipus? It doesn't mean I have to throw Oedipus out.
Right.
What if I just start in a different place? And what would that mean? So that's kind of where I am with it now. And so it's a process of kind of working my way back to, like, I can't throw it all away. And I can't do every completely new, but I can look at some of the pieces that can be kind of rearranged purposefully.
Yeah. And I understand that. For years I taught social theory, and most social theory textbooks will start with Karl Marx, and we've kind of got this, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim as our canon. And for those of you on the call, I'm trained as a sociologist, so hopefully that will make sense. But I too would regularly make great attempts to disrupt the canon, so to speak. So instead of starting with Marx, who was not even a sociologist, who was an economist, but we include him because of the social work that his work in economics, provided. I started with, say, a W.B. Du Bois, the one who started, critical race theory. And again, not throwing out the others for the sake of Du Bois, but starting there and seeing how it shapes the conversation that follows after it. And so by providing that type of, I guess, a different way to move forward, I completely agree. It is unnerving. And as a person who is supposed to be, quote unquote, in charge of the classroom, and I've shared this with you, and I'll just share it now with our participants. Not just being, I'm just going to use the classroom, or me as a professional in the workplace. There's a strong sense of control that I think I want to have, and with that control, I assume that if I understand and have a sense of how all the pieces fit together, it's a very nice neat package at the end. And while that can make me feel really comfortable, it may not actually provide the best learning opportunities for our students or me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is really, and even as I'm saying this, it's making me nervous that I think like this, because I think my brain wants control, because it gives me a very set standard, not a set standard, but it gives me almost predictable outcomes. And yet to do that in moments where we know that things are changing, like the people that we're interacting with are changing, and so are we, there needs to be greater flexibility in what it is what I think I'm actually doing. And so I use this idea of, you probably can't see this very well, but the camera's right here. I've got my fist closed pretty tightly, and I want to hold everything I can within my fist. But what I need to do is actually start to do a bit of this, right? To open it up and to recognize that while I may have expertise in, say, the content, at least the intellectual content, my students are also bringing something to bear. They have, their experiences are so crucial to what's happening in the classroom, what's happening co-curricular and extracurricularly on our college campuses, and UE is no different. So I thought I'd offer that, but let me shift for a moment, because at least for this last part here, so you've kind of talked about, you know, where you are in the process. Can you speak? I think you've talked about this a little bit, but what is it that you have, right? Because it's not just about kind of rewriting what you think you know about your students, but it's what you can offer. So what is it that you have in that, I guess, in that equation, so to speak?
Well, I think that something happens in the classroom that, for me, that is really exciting, and I think this is something that I bring into the room with me. It is an awareness that every single student in that classroom is building an individual identity, and that the more challenged they are and the more new ideas they encounter, the more palpable that growth is. And so it can happen, it can be loud even if they're not talking. Right?
What do you mean?
But that's just one half of the other understanding, I think. The other thing that's going on is that and this class in particular, right? It's the first semester of their first year in college. They are also establishing a community and their identity as part of a community. And those two things happening at the same time is a really intense part of the process. And I have a lot of patience for that process. So I think that's what I bring to it. I have, it's more than just patience with the process. It's like, that is the reason to be there. Because that's happening. So I'm not worried about the fact that it's challenging. If that makes any sense.
You said something there. It does make sense. You said something there where, you know, you said it can be loud, but they're not saying anything. What do you mean by that?
Well, I sometimes joke with the students that I sometimes feel like an auctioneer when I'm in the classroom, right? That I am always looking for the little impulses in the students who maybe have a reaction to something but don't say anything, and then I'm making quick decisions about whether or not to bring that reaction into the space, right? So it's just like this constant awareness of absolutely everything that's going on in the room. And of course I miss things all the time, but yeah, it's just part of, and I'm certainly not the only teacher that experiences this, right? It's just part of what we do in the room. I'm still trying to do it even though it's on Zoom.
Yes.
Right? You know, I'm looking at the screen and I'm looking for every single little impulse in every moment.
I wonder, Diane, if you could talk about that for a little bit. So we had, since March, and then, finishing up the spring semester in an online or virtual format. How does that kind of complicate or, I guess, add to this process for you as an educator, um, who's trying to connect with your students who are coming from, who are working through this kind of personally challenging material, or it's contributing, or it's addressing or hitting on various aspects of who they are as a person. How does this kind of virtual form of education either complicate or or provide opportunities?
Well, I mean, the only thing that it complicates is that because that's important to me, it's going to take more time, right? That I am going to make sure that I'm having individual meetings with students, right? That I'm constantly following up with them. That I am constantly looking for the students who are feeling or signs that students are feeling disconnected, and making sure that they continue to feel connected. So as I'm thinking about my courses, because I volunteered to teach my courses online in the fall, I'm thinking about not only I'm thinking about ways to make sure that that happens, even if I don't happen to notice that a student is needing that kind of support, right? So building into the syllabus required meetings with me, even online.
Mm.
I mean, it's something that I started last year. Anybody who I talked to last year, I'm sure I gave them an earful about the evaluation process that I experimented with, which was I stopped grading without students in the room.
Mm.
So the grading process became a collaborative feedback session. And so it's just kind of a continuation of that, right? Like wherever you are, that's where I want to meet you.
Mm.
But it doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of bigger picture here that we're also thinking about.
Sure. So in our last moments here, I wonder if I'm gonna look at some of the questions, or I at least have one, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit. So this person says, I'm unfamiliar with this play, the play that you were referencing. What exactly is problematic about it?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's a play called M. Butterfly, and it is based on a real story about a French diplomat who was working in China and had an affair with a Chinese opera performer who turned out to be a spy. What this man did not know was that the Chinese opera performer was a man, because in Chinese opera, men traditionally play the roles of these women. So it integrates Madame Butterfly with this story, and the author David Henry Hwang is very interested in exploring imperialism and East-West and gender dynamics. But he's not, it was written in 1988. So the conversation about trans bodies was not the same in 1988 as it is now.
Mm. Sure.
So students are coming, the students come to the reading of the play with that perspective, which this play doesn't address.
Gotcha. So, and I think that's a real appropriate example. I want to add another one here. Let's talk about fences for a moment.
Okay.
So I know that that's a text that you've used over the years, and probably viewed more now because Denzel Washington and Viola Davis, I believe, starred in the film version. How has that played out, I guess, as far as how students have appropriated or kind of worked through that material, especially students of color? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So in this play, the father figure in the play, his name is Troy, and he is a tough parent. He has a speech where he says, basically, he says, "Love you. I don't have to love you. I'm responsible for you." That's, what does love have to do with it, right? And so for years and years and years and years, the students would come in and they would point to that speech and they would say, "He's a really terrible person." And I got used to the flow of the conversation being about like getting the students to see that no, he's not a terrible person, that this is this is connected to much larger things that are going on in the play itself, and also in the community that he's coming from. So I got very used to that trajectory. And in the past few years, students of color, especially Black students, have been frustrated that other people are starting with even starting with that reaction, like even reacting to him in that way. And so when they would get upset that students were reacting in that way, my response was like, okay, but just let them react this way. It's not where they're going to end up, right? I can't start there anymore. I can't let that be the thing that they need to learn to give up, right? I have to start where I had them ending before, and I have to be able to say, and I just read Between the World and Me,
Okay.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Where he makes it very, very clear that this is about protecting the body from being killed. Right? This is a totally different perspective, and we don't even need to tolerate a discussion about whether or not that makes him a good man. Right? In that first moment when it comes up, I don't need to let it be in the air. It just needs to be perfectly clear from the moment. Nope, that's not the problem. Let's look at what's really going on in this play.
Right. That was a striking example because, so just as we've been talking about the starting place, not just for, I was characterizing it as the starting place for students of color. You were talking specifically about Black students, but all of our students have a starting place, and the way in which they're interpreting that material. So having a reaction, right? So they're looking at in this example, fatherhood from their view of how a father ought to relate to his son, right? In that particular text, and without understanding that fatherhood can look very different, and even similar. So, and what I mean by that is not having a wide enough range to recognize that acceptable fatherhood can be, there is a range to it, and there isn't this kind of one size fits all. And to your example of really preparing his son to be able to weather the strains of what it means to live in the community requires a bit of hardness, so that, you know, his son is not taken advantage of. And to be fair, that is a very common, it's quite common. And so perhaps, and I don't want to speak for Black students, but I can talk about my own lived experience, is that that reality, and let me pause for a moment here too, that even within the Black community, as we call it, there is a range of ways of parenting and fathering, so to speak, and mothering, right? So while my father didn't do those things, there was a reason for it, right? I didn't grow up, or I wasn't connected to the streets per se, right? But I learned how to keep my mouth shut so that I didn't get myself into trouble.
Yeah.
And so there are skills that I had to learn in order to survive. And in this example, we're given this really clear example, I think, to where some may view it as completely unacceptable, and yet it's very fitting for the period, right? It should be understandable. So let me at least say, I appreciate that you don't just let it sit anymore and allow it to be resolved over time. You address it when it arises, because and I think even that is a shift. I think something that I've shared with you is that, and this is largely because of how I was trained, I share as many details as possible on the front end instead of treating it like a mystery novel, to where things unfold and it's like, there's this big discovery, this aha at the end. I want my students to know, this is where we're at, this is where I'm trying to get you. And then it's a matter of trust that I can do that.
Well, that right there is a complete rewriting for me.
Yes.
Because that is exactly the opposite of what I have been doing.
Sure. And I suspect for others, I mean, you know, here, I don't want to assume that everyone on the call here is a professor, right? Or in the classroom. But then I guess, how can other folks, so let's say some of our staff members who may be on the call, or administrators, how can they take kind of what we've been talking about here and then apply it perhaps to the work that they do as they're interacting with students, do you think?
I go back to Arthur Ashe.
Yeah.
Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And here's the other thing that feels really, really, really important to me. Because I mean, I'm a pretty emotional person. And so I have to find the space to allow myself to be overwhelmed when I'm faced with this. But then being able to say, it is really important to me to get past the, okay, fine, I'll just do it moment, right? I will never let myself stay there, right? If I catch myself gritting my teeth and saying, okay, fine, whatever, you want me to do it that way, fine, I'll do it that way, right? No. I have to get to, oh, this is the way that I can make this work in a way that is, that I can commit to. And I think anyone can do that.
Yeah, you're, the ability to do that is fraught with with fear.
Yeah.
Perhaps that slows us down. I want to encourage everyone on the call, as I'm a huge proponent in understanding yourself, um, as a way to be able to understand other people. Um, and understanding yourself can include some of the things that you're afraid of, and not just letting it sit there, but then delving into why, that brings that kind of emotion. Um, well, let me pause there. And Diane, thank you so much for at least getting us started and sharing your thoughts, and for being a part of this conversation. Um, I want to say to all of you who are participating, um, we'll get together again next week, and Dr. Val Stein will be joining us from our Department of Religion. The conversation will be obviously somewhat different. She has done a tremendous amount of work in her courses specifically related to race and religion. And I'm hoping that you will join us for that conversation. In the weeks to follow, Dr. Sujin Zhang from the Department of Public Health will be joining us. On July the 29th, we'll have two guests from the Department of Education. So that'll be Dr. Davies Bellamy and Dr. Amy McBride. I'm looking forward to all of these conversations. That will be a really interesting one too, as a tag team, kind of doing some work and talking to us about that. And then on August 5th, we'll finish up, at least for the summer, with Dr. Kevin Gray from our Department of Law, Politics, and Society. He is our professor in the criminal justice program. We'll then take a break and then come back after that. So I invite you to join us. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you so much. Have a good week. I do see some questions here. Oh, a comment. So someone says, thank you, Dr. Brewer and Dr. Shelby. This was so informative. I think I saw something here in the, oh yeah, so more thanks along the way. So thank you all for joining us. Please forgive us for any things that we didn't do well. We will learn. I promise we will learn. So thanks so much. Take care.